by my calculation, at the 12th study of this short letter, and we're in the second chapter of 1 Peter, and we've got as far as the middle of the second chapter. We're going to go to verse 13, as we've done before, I think once or twice, we'll read it in two versions, just to get the gist of it. Of course, there's many versions of the Bible, and many translations, paraphrases. But I think I'll read it in the NIV, the New International Version, and then if someone wants to read it from the King James Version, which I know some of you have, we'll do that, and we'll see if we can get the gist of it. So, chapter 2, 1 Peter, verse 13. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men, whether to the king as supreme authority, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish men. Live as free men, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as servants of God. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the brotherhood of believers. Fear God. Honour the king. And we'll leave it there at verse 17. So just 3 or 4 verses there. So someone got the King James Version. Maybe Cecil, I know you have there. Maybe you could read from verse. Maybe I didn't see it as well. Because you only got one cataract done, didn't you?
Yeah.
You need 2 done.
Yeah.
Anyone else got the King James?
Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be the king as supreme, or unto governors as unto them that are sent by him, for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of them that do well. For so is the will of God, that with well-doing he may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free and not using your liberty for a cloak of maliciousness, but as the servants of God.
One more.
Honour all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honour the king.
Right. Actually, I don't know if you know this, but that last verse you see fairly often on bannerets on the 12th of July. You do. You love the brotherhood, fear God, honour the king. Yeah. And of course, in this week after the last 10 days of the Queen's death, and now we have a king, it's fitting that it says honour the king. But I think it's referring to, we'll come to that towards the end. Let me ask you a question to begin with. When you think about what we believe as Christians, sum it up in a word, our theology, everything that's to do with the gospel and salvation and what we believe, what would you say is the hardest part of that to understand, or to really to accept or come to grips with? There's so much to do with our salvation and what it brings, and our belief in God, our creed. Is there anything that comes right away as part of that that's hard to understand? I have to say for myself, there's lots I don't understand, but I accept it and I believe it, but I don't necessarily always understand it. For example, maybe the most common thing that people kind of struggle to understand is the notion of the Trinity, right? A Godhead, 3 in 1, and 1 in 3. That's hard to kind of get your understanding around that, isn't it? A little bit. It's hard. It's hard, I think, to sometimes to believe in the doctrine of hell, that there is a hell, and that there's people who are going to end up in an everlasting hell, separation from God. That's hard to come to terms with a little bit too. I'm sure there's lots more, but I think the hardest one to put into practice, the hardest one for us as Christians in our theology to put into practice, I don't know if you'll agree with me, is the doctrine of submission. Submission. Most of us, I think, don't like to give up the right to make decisions for ourselves. And we don't like the idea of somebody else telling us what to do. I don't know if you're like that. I'm a bit like that. I think we're all a bit like that. We don't like to give up that right to make our own minds up, and we don't like people telling us what to do. And you know, we come across that early in life as children. We don't like parents telling us what to do, and so on. But someone read Isaiah 53. It's a well-known verse, but if you can look up Isaiah 53 verse 6. And have you got it there?
Yeah, we all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all.
Well, that's really underlining what I just said. All of us have gone our own way. And by nature, we're rebels at heart. We really are. And even sometimes, even when we obey, we don't like to do it, but we sort of know we have to do it. And that's the nature of us. The story is told of a little boy who disobeyed his mother, and as a punishment, she told him to go and sit in a chair in the corner. And after a while, she asked him, "Have you learned your lesson yet?" And with a look of defiance on his face, he said, "I'm sitting on the outside, but I'm standing on the inside." and you know, we smile, we laugh at a story like that. Sitting on the outside, but standing up on the inside. And this text that we've read here, these verses, is God's answer, really, in His Word here, to this. One of the spirits of this age is anti-authority. You don't have to think too much about that. We live in an age. There's a spirit of anti-authority nearly everywhere you look. You know, there's years ago, if a policeman caught you doing something, the fear of God would be in you. But now people, kids, teenagers, they don't care. They don't care. In fact, they'll be defiant. And so on. And if a policeman brought you home, you would get another go from your parents. And there's an anti-authority attitude towards parents even, in many ways, in the world today, and we live in that sort of world. But these verses really are a framework, if you like, for understanding how we as Christians should relate to the different areas of life and the various, if I can call this, the circles of authority that are around us and in which we live. And there's an authority structure in the home and in the church, and there's an authority structure in the school system, in the classroom, in a job, in the office, in the shop, in the factory, at all levels of human government. In fact, wherever you find a human institution of any kind, you'll find people in authority, and you'll find people who are under authority. And you might have been in both situations. You've been in authority, you've been given authority. Maybe you were a foreman or something, or you were an owner or whatever. But you also, most of us live our lives under authority. We have to submit to someone. It was very much like that, Tony, when you were in the army. You were under authority.
That's right.
And when the sergeant or the commander at arms said jump, you just asked how high. And you did it, right? You didn't question it. You couldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Peter is writing to help us know how we should relate to various types of authority, because we need to know how to respond and why, and we need to see how God relates to all these areas of authority that he has placed over us. And Peter is saying, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men. And there's a principle there in those first two verses. You know, he says, whether to the king as supreme authority, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. Peter begins, and God through Peter and the Holy Spirit begins with a simple, clear statement. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men. We're to submit to all those in authority over us. I don't know how much you think about that. So let me just rephrase that, make it more contemporary. We're to submit ourselves to Prime Minister Micheál Martin. We're to submit ourselves to the Supreme Court of Ireland and all the judiciary system. We're to submit ourselves to the government at all levels, local and county and national. And we're to submit ourselves to An Garda Síochána and to school authorities, and we could go on. And the list could be extended and so on. But the truth is, we all live under multiple layers of authority. And it's very likely, we're human, but it's very likely that we won't care for some of those people who are in authority over us, or we might not care for the laws that they pass and the rules that they make. And there'll always be leaders that we don't trust. There'll be laws that are passed that we don't like, and there'll be taxes that we don't want to pay, right? So what do we do? What do we do when we come up against all of that, whatever sphere it is? Peter's answer, God's answer is clear. What do you think it is? Submission. We're to submit. We're to submit. And the word submit actually is a military term. Literally means to get in line. To get in line. And even if we don't like the rules or the authority that's over us, we have to get in line. We have to get in line anyway. And there's no exceptions. According to these verses, there's no exceptions. And that's the part that gives us trouble sometimes. Most of us understand that, lines of authority are necessary so that our society can function and function the way it should. But whenever we read a text like this, we almost immediately will say, if not outwardly, maybe inwardly on the inside, we'll say, well, that's all right, but, and we quickly have a dozen, yes, that's okay, but, and we start to kind of undermine what Peter's saying here, what God's word is saying. But we have to start with the command that's here and get it clearly into our minds, because only then will we be able to properly deal with all of this with no exceptions. If we start with, that's all right, but, yes, but, we'll end up emptying this command of its meaning. And then Peter, that's the principle, we're to submit. But then there's a reason, an inner reason. He says in the first part of verse 13, we're to submit for the Lord's sake. That's the reason, the inner reason. Now, what does he mean when he says we're to submit for the Lord's sake? What do you think he means by that, for the Lord's sake?
Do it all for the Lord. As if you build it onto the Lord.
That's more or less it. Totally, you're right. It means that there's a direct connection between the people in authority over us and God, who is the ultimate authority. Right? He's at the very top. ultimately. And all these other layers of authority that we, whatever area of life we're living in and functioning in, they exist and they are where they are by God's permission. Now, they may not realise that, they may not understand that themselves, because if God didn't will it so, if He didn't will that they should be there, well then teachers couldn't teach, and bosses couldn't be bosses, and they couldn't exist apart from God. Someone read Romans chapter 13 and verse 1. Romans chapter 13 verse 1. Because it tells us this very plainly. The reason. And we don't like to get our heads and hearts around this, but Romans 13 verse 1.
Everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God.
Even those that might seem, cruel, dictators in parts of the world, and harsh, Romans 13:1 says, everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. And they exist having been established by God. We submit to authority because God has commanded us to do that, and because He has established all forms of human authority. Now that means that submission, as we've been talking about, is really submission to authority, whatever it is really an aspect of our submission to God. Remember in Acts chapter 10, Peter's given a vision of a sheet containing all sorts of animals being lowered from heaven, both clean and unclean according to the Old Testament law. And when the Lord told Peter to kill the animals and eat them, Peter said, "No, Lord." And those two words should never go together, should never be spoken together. If you're going to say no, don't say Lord. And if you're going to say Lord, don't dare to tell Him no. And we'll never fully understand this submission, this importance of submission, until we connect it to our obedience to Christ. Once we see that the Lord is intimately involved in every detail of our lives, and we don't always understand that, but He is, then we'll understand that obedience to authority is really obedience to God. And we'll be able to give that obedience for the Lord's sake, as Peter says it here, because we know that He's with us, He's watching over us, even when we think the command that we're obeying is stupid or it's crazy. We're to submit to authority. We'll talk a bit in a few minutes about, well, what if we're asked to do something we don't want to do as Christians, so we shouldn't do as Christians? That's a whole different thing. So the inner reason is that we're to do it for the Lord's sake. But then there's an outer reason that Peter tells us about in verse 15. He says, "For it's God's will that by doing good, obeying authority, submitting to authority, you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish men." One of the objections to submitting to authority might be having to do with unjust rulers, right? Unjust rulers. It's hard enough, to submit to authority in some ways when you have a good boss, or you have a wise teacher and you're under them as a student, or you have an honest leader, or you have a fair employer, or you have a compassionate police officer, and so on. But what do you do if your teacher is mean, or your boss is unfair, or the principal won't listen to you, or you don't trust the people up in the Dáil? What do you do then? Well, surely Peter's words don't apply then, do they? Do they?
I think so. I think it does.
Yeah.
Because they're giving out the authority.
Yeah.
Whatever they give out,
Uh-huh.
it's still, the Lord has it there for a reason.
Uh-huh.
And we're going through a test as well
Yeah.
to see how would you react.
Yes. Yes. It is a test. Test of our obedience to this this issue of submission to rulers and to authority. You know, when Peter wrote, and we mentioned it earlier about, you know, at the end, honour the king. Another translation says emperor. He was referring to Nero in his time. That's who was the ultimate earthly leader or ruler. And he was one of the worst emperors to ever rule the Roman Empire. He was cruel, he was wicked, he was immoral, he was sadistic, he persecuted Christians in particular, and his hatred for Christians is well known. Yet Peter says, somebody read it for me, that last 3 words? Honour the king, honour the emperor. Now that takes a lot of doing. That takes a lot of doing. And as he said, rulers exist in authority to reward good behaviour and to punish evildoers. So if you do what's right, you should have nothing to fear. And if you do wrong, you shouldn't be surprised if you get into trouble. Right? Would you agree?
Yeah.
If you do right, you've nothing to fear.
Yes.
But if you do something wrong, then don't start crying and complaining, because doing something wrong brings a consequence, brings a punishment, and we should expect that. You know, let's say I'm going home tonight and there's a wee speed trap down the road and I get caught, and I deserve to be fined because I've done something wrong, something that I shouldn't have done. And the fact that maybe I had various excuses isn't going to make any difference, really. Now in Canada, there's a nice little system actually. When you're caught speeding or, you know, breaking the law in some way, a minor way, I'm talking about road traffic stuff, you can plead guilty or not guilty or guilty with an excuse. And I did that once. And what that means is that you're saying, yes, I did something wrong, but here's the reason. And you're throwing yourself at the mercy of the judge or the magistrate. I did that once and I got the fine reduced because he thought it was a reasonable excuse. But I was still guilty at the end of the day. You know, if a policeman stops you and you're caught, the fact that, you know, you don't exchange Bible verses through the car window makes no difference. He's not there to chat with me. As Peter says, his job in that moment is to punish wrongdoers, which I would be if I was speeding and caught doing it, and so on. So when we obey the law, we have nothing to fear and we can't be criticised. But when we disobey the law and we fly in the face of authority, all the excuses in the world really aren't going to matter. And then he goes on, Peter goes on in the next verse, verse 16, to remind us that submission actually brings freedom. Now, most of the times, you know, when you think about freedom, you think about submission, you nearly think that we're opposites. We sort of assume that if we somehow choose to submit to something, that means giving up our freedom. And if we choose freedom, well, we don't have to submit to anyone. We're a free bird. We can fly any way we want. But in any area of life and living, including our spiritual life, spiritual growth, there's no substitute for discipline and commitment and personal submission, which, you know, a lot of the time usually involves a struggle to do something that we don't want to do, or something we don't think is necessary, or follow instructions from a person we don't trust and don't respect. And at that point, if we ever get into that situation, we have two choices. And there's two dangers that we face. First is this, it's a simple one, but it's true to life. We'll talk too much about it. Proverbs 10:8 says, the wise in heart accepts commands, but a chattering fool comes to ruin. Sergeant Major tells you you're to button up your uniform. Well, you can chat away about why you can't button it up, or you're only going to button 3 buttons because the 4th one's too tight, and other. You can chat away, and sometimes we just get ourselves into more trouble because, we didn't like what we were asked, and we just kept yapping about it, complaining about it. And how did the serpent get Eve to disobey instead of submit to God?
God did.
Yeah, he got her talking. And she talked herself into disobedience. Sometimes we just need to shut up and do what we've been asked. Right? No complaints. The second danger is that we'll begin, as I said, to make excuses. We say things like, well, I don't agree with that, so I don't have to submit to that. Or, he doesn't know what he's talking about, so I'm not going to do that. Or, that's just stupid, and so on. And so, Peter warns us not to use our freedom as a cover-up for the sin of disobedience. There are Christians who get carried away with this notice of freedom, this notion of freedom, and they think that they're not bound by any earthly laws. They have freedom in Christ. They can be anything, do anything, and so on. That's just an excuse for spiritual anarchy, and it happens in the world when people don't have any allegiance to any authority over them. They just go crazy. They go wild. You see it a lot in these riots and disturbances, and they're looting and they're busting windows and they're attacking people, and it's freedom gone mad. And yes, we're free from the guilt of sin when we get saved, when we become a Christian, and we're free from the demands of the Old Testament legal system, but we're not free to do our own thing and do anything we want to do. We still have to submit. We're not the center of our own universe. And we're free, certainly free to submit to God, to serve Him by serving other people. Martin Luther put it this way: a Christian is a perfectly free Lord of all, subject to none, but a Christian is also a perfectly dutiful servant of all, subject to all. We're both free and bound at the same time. It's not our opinion or our comfort that matters, it's our obedience to God, in submission to Him, through the authorities that are set up really by Him, that is all that matters. We vote. There's talk about another election up north on the 28th of October. If they don't get their act together and get back into government, there has to be an election. But you've had elections. We had many elections. But you don't lose your sanity if your candidate that you voted for doesn't get in. Right? Politics isn't the final measure of anything. Candidates come and go, and nobody serves in government forever. But in the ultimate scheme of things, politics doesn't really matter. It's God that matters. We obey those over us not because we like them, but because ultimately they're only here temporarily, as God ordains, and so on. And then in verse 17, really Peter sums it all up. He's saying that all people deserve respect, especially those in authority over us. No matter what we think about them, they deserve respect because of the position that they're in. So he says, honor everyone, love your Christian brothers and sisters, fear God, and honour the king. Now, we know some people aren't honourable because of the way they live their lives and all the rest of it, but we're to honour them anyway. And some people are not lovable. We know that only too well. But we're to love them anyway. There's no escape clause attached to this command because submission is first and foremost a matter of the heart. I mean, how much honour do you really give someone if you obey them, but you're obeying them with clenched teeth? You're sitting on the outside, but you're standing up on the inside, defiant. And we can't say, well, you know, I only answer to God. I only answer to Jesus. Because although we do answer to God, we do answer to Him, we also answer to a whole host of people who are put in authority over us. And we're to submit graciously, we're to submit willingly, we're to submit honourably, remembering that we don't have the right to pick and choose who we'll submit to, or what authority we'll obey or will not obey. So, to sum it up, the authority structure, no matter where it is, according to these verses, has been established by God. And no president, no mayor, or foreman, or judge, or scout leader, or sports coach can serve apart from serving at God's will, whether they understand it or not. That's the way God has set up the universe. And all of us are in authority and under authority at the same time. And God has placed us where we are for a reason, and that's very, very critical and central to this whole idea of submission. We're not where we are in our lives at any moment in time just randomly. God has, planned our lives, and He's sovereign over it all. And as often as not, He'll put us into uncomfortable situations or places, because that's the only way we learn to grow. If God only allowed us to be in comfortable, easy places, we'd never be stressed, we'd never be pushed out of our comfort zone, we'd never fall on our faces in prayer before Him, we'd never stay up late wondering what's going to happen next. Those uncomfortable places in society include being under authority to those that we don't like and those we don't respect. And if you find yourself in that place occasionally, remember that you're not there by accident. God has placed you there, and you still have to submit to Him through them, really. So, as I said, submission is first of all an attitude of the heart. It's not blind obedience, because it's an attitude of the heart. And sometimes we'll disagree, and we'll make our disagreement known about something forcibly that we don't agree with. And it doesn't mean that we don't work to make the situation better, and it doesn't mean that you have to stay where you are indefinitely. Sometimes we have to speak out against things that we know are wrong. And I believe there's times when, as a last resort, certain laws may have to be broken. That's the only way out of some situations. If our Christian commitment causes us to protest an unjust law, that's not my car. Sometimes it goes off, and we probably is. I think we look out there, see if my.
I think it is.
Yeah, it is. Sounded like my car. Well, I'll have to submit and obey and go out and maybe the keys here, maybe. No, it does. It's very sensitive. It obeyed. It submitted. It knows better. Well, if our Christian commitment causes us to protest some unjust law and to disobey it, we can't turn around and claim divine exception from punishment. The authorities will deal with us, even though we've protested, we felt we were right or just in protesting about something. We still have to answer to that law as well. And so that's all to do with the humble submission to authority, even authority we don't disagree with. And you know, as I was thinking about this and writing this out, I did a little survey on the inside of my own rebel heart, so to speak, and I find that I don't like submission like anybody else. You know, I'm just, we were all created, you know, to stand up for ourselves, but I've learned some things over the years that living under authority is a freedom, really. The greatest freedom of all. It provides protection. You know, when we live under authority, it provides protection and direction and security. And the opposite happens when we rebel. It leads to anarchy and destruction. And so if we must disobey or protest, we're still to honour the king in some way. That means obeying when and where we can, and not disobeying just because of personal choice or personal convenience. But as we bring this to a close, I'm sure you've been thinking about this as I've been talking. Two questions come to the fore. What do you do if those who are in authority over you, in whatever sphere it is, seem to be just fools or worse? What do you do when you have no respect for people and the way that they set about their authority? What do you think you should do?
Pray.
I'm sure a lot of people in Russia are feeling that way now.
Pray for them.
There still has to have respect for them, because Jesus had respect for everyone. He died for everybody.
Yeah, pray for them, support them if you can. Work for change if you can. Obey them as much as you can. Don't speak evil of them. Show them honour in how you treat them. But what if you're told to do something that you know in your Christian conscience and in your Christian beliefs is wrong?
I don't do it.
And seek the Lord about it.
Bobby, you're right on. You don't do it. Submission, in that sense, is not an excuse for violating God's commandments and God's ways. But just make sure that it's God's commandments that you're violating or that are being violated, and not just your personal preferences about something. And so, really, when you look at those verses, the text mentions God, I think, about 4 times in 5 verses. Why do you think Peter felt the need to do that? Because the answer really is simple.
To get it into the people's brains.
Yeah. To get into the people's brain, it's not about you, it's not about them, it's not about you, it's not about your boss, it's not about your teacher, it's not about who's in authority over you, it's about God and submission to God through them. It's about, and until we grasp that and understand that, you know, chances are we'll struggle in some areas of authority. And so the questions come down to, do I believe that God's in control of my life down to the tiniest detail? I don't know about you, but I absolutely do. And do I believe that God wants me where He wants me to be right now? I believe that as well. And I think you have to come to that conclusion about your own lives as well. That our lives aren't random and lived with, you know, with no purpose at all. God has it all planned, and we have to submit ultimately to Him. Oswald Chambers, who wrote a lovely devotional book called My Utmost for His Highest. Any of you come across that? Yeah. Lovely, lovely little devotional book. You can read it over and over and over again. And he often included a 3-word phrase near the end of everything that he wrote, summing up his whole life. And these 3 words that he wrote were, be absolutely His. And that's what Peter really is underlining here. Be absolutely his at home, be absolutely his at church, be absolutely his when you're at work, be absolutely his in every relationship. Because in the end, submission is not about us obeying somebody else or about following somebody else's set of rules. Submission is a spiritual issue between us and God. And it touches every part of our lives, because behind every human authority stands God. He's the ultimate authority. And we have to be mindful of that. A rebellious spirit against authority is actually a form of rebellion against God. It really is. And that's why this is one of the hardest things to obey in Scripture. It runs counter to our fallen, selfish nature. We want to be the author of our own ways. We do want people telling us what to do and all of that, like I said at the start. Well, you could ask, is there anyone who's ever lived like that, to be absolutely God's? Well, there is, and his name's Jesus. And so we're driven back again, even in these verses, to the cross, because it's the power of the cross that we need. Submission is our Christian calling, it's our privilege, and it's our greatest challenge sometimes in all areas of life. And you know, the greatest challenge to it, well, you can talk about politics, and you can talk about not liking laws and things that governments do, or you can talk about law and order and submitting to this, that and the other. You can talk about bosses, this, that and the other. But one of the greatest areas where our attitude of our heart towards submission is exposed is where?
Exposed to God. God knows everything.
Well, God knows everything, that's right, Tony. But it gets exposed when it comes into the church. Because God has set authority in the church.
That's right, yeah.
And whether we like it or not, it's there. And sometimes people will huff and puff and say, well, I'm not going to do that, or I don't want to do that. Well, the rest of them, the next thing you know, they're already here, because they don't want to submit to authority. The authority that God has put over the church. And, you know, that's just the way it is. And there's no way around that, or in any other sphere of life. So we'll leave it there tonight. What's your thoughts about all that?